Cool. So, you ready to jump into the book?
Ready? What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book? You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Well, welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club, where we are working our way through this tome, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by the Davids, Graeber, and Wengrow. Today we're going to try to talk about chapters 3 and 4. We'll start with chapter 3 and see how it goes. And there's a lot of material here to discuss, so see what you guys think. I am trying to organize it around, well, really whatever we feel like is interesting or worthy of discussion in these chapters. And I'm aware that some of them might not be used to reading that kind of book. So I try to give them reading tips about, how to make the process smoother. Sometimes with a big book, you're like, oh God, I got to understand all these words on all these pages. Each chapter, they're making some kind of argument. If you can figure out what their argument for that specific chapter is, understand the argument, understand a few examples that they give to support their argument, you kind of get the point. It's okay if you don't understand every word of every paragraph on every page or whatever. So I thought about just starting there of what are the arguments that the Davids are making in chapter 3. What are the arguments that stood out to you guys? If you have anything that comes to mind right away.
Yeah, if I was going to give my shot at this, I think the thesis statement or whatever around this chapter would be like, people were people as soon as we became people. There's a really common thing where people tend to look at ancient civilizations or ones that we don't know about and just assume that they didn't have the same capacity, like they were different than us, right? Like they were like stuck in these ways where they just couldn't think the same way we could, even though they were Homo sapiens, right? Like, so I think that was kind of like my big takeaway. And the fact that he mentioned sapiens in this chapter made me laugh. I was like, oh yeah. But yeah, that was kind of like the same part, like comparing us basically. That specific part where he mentioned sapiens was talking about how, but anyway, how he basically made the comparison of like ancient humans to either chimpanzees or like bonobos, right? Like to these tribes versus primate tribes versus like being people, right? So I feel like that's my big takeaway from this chapter.
Thanks. One, I'm really thankful for book club. As I was reading it, I thought like it's really nice to be able to relate to a lot of these, to express them. It's like cathartic to share them with y'all and to hear your experiences and know that we're not isolated in these feelings. It made me appreciate like this book could be reread many times. And I'm sure you're going to glean different stuff each time. I thought that this chapter specifically, I liked how it kind of pointed out like there might be this notion in history that Western man is more sophisticated than others. And that kind of gets the illusionment comes away from that. And then two, I thought that there was a quote, distant times can become a vast canvas for the working out of our collective fantasies. And I thought that was really poignant on this chapter because it's really trying to pull the curtain back on a single history narrative and provide the multitude of how it came to be and uncovering that.
Totally. Remember when we first started talking about this book, Cody, you just asked me if I had any thoughts comparing this book to Sapiens from Yuval Noah Harari. And I knew in the back of my head, I was like, there's some reason why I'm not super confident. And then I read this chapter again. I was like, oh yeah, this is the thing. Because they do a lot of, when you get into academic reading and stuff, sometimes it can get kind of boring and dry. But if you start to pay attention to the drama between academics, it gets a little more interesting because they're always like subtly talking shit about each other in the footnotes or whatnot. And these authors, I feel like, do a good, they're rigorous. They don't make any outlandish, unfounded claims, but they don't, pull their punches. If they have some critiques to make against their historian colleagues or whoever, they just come out and say them. So yeah, they had that moment with Sapiens about, he's, like you said, comparing the warlike ancient humans to chimpanzees and the more peaceful like ancient humans to bonobos. And the authors are like, well, You know, he could have easily just as easily done biker gangs and hippie communes instead of chimpanzees and bonobos. Why are you comparing humans to non-humans? It's like a dehumanizing thing to do, literally. Because that's the huge takeaway for me for this chapter too, is that human beings are human beings, and we've always been human beings. There is this notion of human society moving through progressive stages, getting better and better. In our modern world, we like to think that we're progressing towards some ultimate future. But I think a lot of the points that they're making in this book is that humans do all kinds of things all the time, and that we've always sort of gone through different experiments with society, and there's never been like one progressive line of improvement. You know, just because you have agriculture doesn't mean you're better than civilizations that don't do agriculture. They point out examples of ancient humans who specifically decided not to do agriculture because they were like, that seems like a lot of work. We don't really want to get trapped in that. So we're going to keep doing our thing. It's a refreshing take because it relieves us of the burden of having to figure out what the line of progress is. There's not necessarily a line of progress. We've done all kinds of things throughout our time. What I appreciate about their perspective is that it invites readers to exercise their creativity and curiosity about the past. In the absence of evidence, we don't have to assume that nothing happened. We can just be like, okay, something obviously happened because human beings have been around for a long time. What evidence do we have of anything happening, and what can we say about it? Humans make conscious political choices, period. Human beings make conscious political choices, even if it's before agriculture, even if it's before evidence of written language or anything like that. There are conscious political choices groups of humans make with each other about how they want to live, what kind of society they want to build, and everything. On page 86, I had underlined some things near the bottom of the page about actuarial intelligence. So I'll just read from this paragraph. It's the second full paragraph on the page. They write, for instance, while gorillas do not mock each other for beating their chests, humans do so regularly. Even more strikingly, while the bullying behavior might well be instinctual, counter-bullying is not. It's a well thought out strategy. And forager societies who engage in it display what Boehm, another writer, calls actuarial intelligence. That's to say, they understand what their society might look like if they did things differently. If, for instance, skilled hunters were not systematically belittled, or if elephant meat was not portioned out to the group by someone chosen at random, as opposed to the person who actually killed the beast. This, he concludes, is the essence of politics, which is the ability to reflect consciously on different directions one society could take and to make explicit arguments why it should take one path rather than another. And when we resort to these comparisons with great apes, with chimpanzees or bonobos, we're removing the reasonable belief that ancient humans were making conscious political human choices about their society. And I think we have to be able to respect the intelligence of ancient humans and trust that if they had the same minds and bodies that we have, even if they had different technology, they're still able to have conversations with each other to make complex choices about what their society should look like, to reject hierarchy in one case or support it in another case, or just sort of negotiate what the terms of their society look like. So I thought that was really refreshing to see.
I actually had the paragraph right above that highlighted for a similar reason, right? I thought it was interesting. It's kind of hitting the same point, obviously, but the big thing for these 2 pages to me was talking about that central issue that we are kind of arguing now, right? Like in our society, the Hobbesian hawks versus Rousseauian doves, like doves versus hawks, or like that kind of thing, is kind of where we are. I mean, in the US, I think at the moment, right? Like to an extreme version. The paragraph, it said Boehm's own work is revealing in this regard. An evolutionary anthropologist and specialist in primate studies, he argues that while humans do have an instinctual tendency to engage in dominance submissive behavior, no doubt inherited from our simian ancestors, what makes societies distinctively human is our ability to make conscious decision not to act that way. And then it talks through just leading into the paragraph you read, how there was a lot of the anthropological evidence of, that shaming and ridiculing and shunning of individuals in these groups. Like, it's like these techniques developed to basically take those that might have more authoritarian tendencies, like, You think of the hunter, if that person was put on a pedestal and like, oh, this is the most important person, what in their mind could come from that? And so these people were like, we need to take that guy down a peg or two. We just need to make sure he doesn't turn out to be a crazy person. So I just thought that was super interesting because, like, I don't think that would have been in my mind. Like, I wouldn't have been thinking about that, probably like 2 years ago if I thought about ancient hunter-gatherer tribes, right? You would think like, oh, the hunter is the strongest. They're going to be the apex. They're going to run everything and they're going to like be the chieftain. But no, in this case, they were like, good job, nerd. Bring us our food or something like that.
Yeah, this is so unacademic, but do you remember that? I mean, I know you remember it, Cody. I don't know if Arthur, if it was on your radar when it came up on the internet, but that Samesies video, you remember that old Samesies video of the skit, the ancient humans just sort of making fun of each other? It seems so silly and non-serious or whatever, but reading this book, it just makes it seem, oh, maybe that was actually closer to the reality of these ancient humans just talking shit about each other and, oh, this guy's getting an ego. We got to take him down a notch so he doesn't try to boss us all around. Always having complicated political conversations with each other about the way our society should operate.
But it kind of highlights the whole point of the chapter and these quotes that you guys are bringing up, which is like their term of seasonality and experimenting with different value systems with what works at the time, what doesn't work at the time, and how now we've gotten to this mutability stuckness, I guess.
Yeah, the seasonality thing was super interesting to me. Just like, I guess as a concept, like just thinking about like, what if the U.S. like, I mean, it's hard to think about with the structure as large as we have, right? Like in the United States, like as a nation state of like 300 million people. But if it was like a town thing where during the spring and summer and like into the fall, one person's in charge because they know how to harvest the best, right? Like as soon as the harvest is done, we just go back to doing, no one's in charge, like live as you want. Like the hard part's done that required us to work together and have some sort of hierarchy and structure. And like now that that's done, we no longer need that and everyone can live as they choose, right? Like, I don't know. It's just an interesting concept to me, thinking about the willingness for people to do that on a cyclical nature. Just like, yeah, I understand my role. Like my role is to get, the hunt done or like to do the harvest or something like that. And then I can not be in charge and be totally fine with that. Like the mindset there that a group of people would have to organize around that is just really interesting to think about for me. I'm sure there's places that it still happens, but.
Yeah, and that's like pointing to like the big question they ask at the end of this chapter is like they sort of turn the question back on modern society, like how did we get stuck into one way of living? Not like how does society progress to this magnificent moment in human history that we live in now, but how are we stuck as a human culture in this one way of living? Because seasonality is so interesting. And like part of it is, just to summarize, it's like different modes of organizing society for different times of the year. A lot of these big sites, like the one they point to in this chapter, Poverty Point down in Louisiana, these huge mounds and structures and evidence of massive gatherings of people. We often think that cities and massive settlements were not possible until the development of agriculture and people getting stuck in one way of living. But sites like Poverty Point indicate that human societies were having massive gatherings and massive amounts of organization outside of this rigid agricultural kind of civilization. And they suggest that the reason that Poverty Point doesn't get as much attention is because it doesn't fit the typical narrative that we're comfortable with. It sort of upends the whole idea of stages of human development and forces us to go back to the drawing board about what actually happened. But there's evidence of people collaborating over vast distances. Like they were talking about the evidence of measurements and math that are consistent from North America all the way to South America over this period. Like people had the same system of measuring and building things over all of the Western Hemisphere almost. And it's like they didn't have these kinds of, these were all seasonal cultures. These were all changing throughout the year. It makes me wonder if we should take a podcast vacation to Poverty Point and explore some of these sites that are here on this continent.
Yeah, be our first annual gathering.
There's this point I wanted to ask you guys about with dialogic thought. which I thought was kind of interesting because you were saying earlier, Cody, about how there's this assumption that people couldn't even think in the sophisticated way that we can think these days. For some reason, they weren't able to have long, conscious trains of thought. And they tend to point to some evidence about studies showing that people can pay attention to one thing on their own for like 7 seconds before they get distracted and start thinking about something else, except in conversations with each other. And if you ever just think about the way, I don't know, I do a lot of meditation and stuff, so I'm constantly just trying to think about the way my mind wanders. But for me, it tends to be dialogic. I'm like imagining conversations in my head. If I just sit there and let my mind wander, eventually I'm going to be making up some conversation in my head. And that's how I'm able to sustain a train of thought, is by imagining it as a kind of back and forth between myself and somebody else, or between two different people or whatever. But just imagining the conversation allows me to sustain the thought. And this is their point on page 94. So often, even if we're trying to figure something out by ourselves, we imagine arguing with or explaining it to someone else. Human thought is inherently dialogic. Ancient philosophers tended to be keenly aware of all this. That's why, whether they're in China, India, or Greece, they tended to write their books in the form of dialogues. Humans were only fully self-conscious when arguing with one another, trying to sway each other's views, or working out a common problem. True individual self-consciousness, meanwhile, was imagined as something that a few wise sages could perhaps achieve through long study, exercise, discipline, and meditation. But they're talking about political consciousness. I mean, the same thing in that Samesies video. These people are just talking to each other about what their society should look like. This is what we've always been doing as human beings, and having that healthy back and forth allows them to constantly critique the way society is and to make different choices. So if you're imagining a seasonal culture, if you're imagining living in a seasonal society, okay, now we're doing the hierarchy time of the year where there are some temporary bosses and stuff. But for those bosses, if you know that, first of all, 6 months from now, this is all going to go away and you're going to go back to the other way of being, and then next year it's going to be somebody else's turn to be the boss, you got to be careful about how far you take your whole boss act, because if you get out of hand, it's going to come back in a bad way the next time around, right? I like that kind of hierarchy. If we're going to have a hierarchy, I like those people in charge to know that it's temporary and somebody else is going to be their boss next year. I think that's healthy.
Yeah, I agree with that. There was something you mentioned there, Joe, like the conversation piece is interesting. I think the same way. Like, whenever I'm trying to think through a problem, I'm having a conversation with myself in my head. I definitely have that type of inner monologue going on. I know some people don't, or supposedly some people don't. I don't even know how people can think without an inner monologue. But yeah, that was really interesting. And I'm wondering if it's just because if you're in your own head and you're not trying to have this debate, you're not trying to understand maybe someone else's opinion, or like if you're trying to sway somebody else to your side, to just force you to think more deeply about why it is you have the beliefs that you have, and to try to justify that to yourself, and that way be able to justify it to somebody else. Like, that's kind of how I was reading that, right? Like, it just forces you to think more about what you're saying if you have to try and be persuasive. This kind of comes into what we talked about before, where we all inherently have some sort of bias, or we have some preconceived notion of how things should be based off of what's happened to us in the past. And so that act of dialogue forces you to analyze that a little bit. That's kind of how I read that.
Yeah, I like the notion, and it also like gave rise to, yeah, like how I think the next paragraph or something, they talk about it like a Western philosophy tradition, and like, you know, like Socrates is really well known for like this whole dialogical thought. All of his, anything we got on Socrates is all dialogue, and it's written by Plato. And actually it happened everywhere. And it's like, it's really like a campfire thing, you know, council thing. It seems like people had this dialogue in earnest and being open. And same thing with what you're saying, Cody. Like, if I have a political thought and I talk about it in like a honest, open way to somebody else, and they do the same thing and they share their experience, it's more likely to get me to the center of my thought. And I love how it's a constant negotiation of dialogue. That should be like definitely a thing. We should all, there should be a constant negotiation of dialogue. 4 years is a long time without any sort of, it's just silent obedience, you know? There's no open dialogue there.
Yeah, I feel like you can tell a lot about a leader by how they handle being questioned. Like if they immediately get flustered and upset and say a lot of incoherent things and can't justify their choices and stuff, bad news. Bad news. But yeah, we were talking, I think in the early chapters, we were talking about Candiaronk and some of these early European colonists encountering, intellectual people in the indigenous scene and having these critiques about European culture and everything. Leaders in the indigenous groups were only leaders insofar as they were convincing. As soon as they stopped being convincing, they got usurped or kicked out or whatever.
Yeah, if someone gets flustered, but at the same time, if the way that they are as leaders is descriptive, you must do this because it's the right thing, or like you're going to do this because, X, like without any why or anything like that, other than it's right because we say so. The right or might makes right, philosophy on all of that. Yeah. I think what we saw with the Vance Miller Hegseth combo at the what station was that in Washington D.C. when they went into the train station, kind of like what they're saying, like we're gonna do this, we're gonna we're going to bring in we're gonna bring in more law enforcement because you're protesting, like very very much prescriptive authoritarianism. But what if they knew that 1 year later, you know, like someone like the mayor of DC was then going to be in charge or something like that, right? Like someone from DC was then going to be in charge like a year later, might change the tone.
Yeah, for real. And they were talking about European culture before the modern era. Stonehenge, for example, was a site constructed by one of these seasonal cultures.
Right.
It's another site that was set up and people gathered seasonally for it. It wasn't like a permanent settlement type thing. European history is a history of kings and dukes and duchesses and all that stuff. They were suggesting that the first kings were basically play kings for ceremonies, for seasonal rites and rituals and stuff. And then at a certain point, somebody's playing a character, just, it's my turn to be king this year or whatever. And they just let it go to their head, start convincing other people to settle down with them. And this is your job now. This is your job now. You got to listen to what I say. So some actor just took the job way too seriously at some point, and maybe that's one way we started getting stuck.
Yeah. Does that mean that Saranac Lake will eventually be taken over by whoever the king of the Winter Carnival is, king and queen of Winter Carnival? Like,
That would be
a few
great.
years from now.
That's how it should be.
Right, right. No, I think like that's yeah, it's that was interesting. And then the talk about I can't remember who was making the argument. I should have marked this down, but it was talking about how like someone didn't think that we could really have a truly egalitarian society when we set up around, or when society is set up structurally to create surplus. Like I can't remember if that was the third chapter or fourth chapter, but like talking about how surplus plays a role into that and inherently just ends up creating power that people take advantage of. So I thought that was interesting too, like how just by having more than you need, it like enables people to not work together, really. Like almost like as a way to think about it. Like if you have a surplus and you're stockpiling it, then I don't need to worry about like working with the group on a hunt, right? Like, or working with the group on some sort of foraging, right? Um, and maybe this all points to what they're saying too there about like, we've been humans forever. Clearly there were people smart enough to figure out a way to take advantage of the system in order to become kings and queens and whatnot, right? So like, I mean, it's clear that they set up something that worked for them.
Yeah, for sure. I'm super glad you mentioned the surplus thing, and I was like trying to find where it is. Uh, just a nerd tip, use the index. I was like, where to find surplus? I just went to the index and found surplus, page 128. Let's go. So just on your point about surplus, Cody, I'll just read this paragraph. It's from the next chapter, but we'll circle back and cross our T's and dot our I's on chapter 3. Just this paragraph on surplus, they write, at this juncture, we need to focus on the very notion of surplus and the much broader, almost existential questions it raises. As philosophers realized long ago, this is a concept that poses fundamental questions about what it means to be human. One of the things that sets us apart from non-human animals is that animals produce only and exactly what they need. Humans invariably produce more. We are creatures of excess. And this is what makes us simultaneously the most creative and most destructive of all species. Ruling classes are simply those who have organized society in such a way that they can extract the lion's share of that surplus for themselves, whether through tribute, slavery, feudal dues, or manipulating ostensibly free market arrangements. Ostensibly is like a sarcastic word in academia. Ostensibly meaning you say it's free market, but it's not really free market. And yeah.
So same as like basically supposedly in this scenario, supposedly free markets.
Exactly the same meaning. Yeah. I have a couple of wrap up paragraphs for chapter 3 I can read for us to talk about if you want to do that, or if you have other moments from chapter 3 you want to bring up as well. This is from page 115, these 2 paragraphs at the top of
I
the
got
page.
one on 115 too.
Nice.
Could be
It might be the same one.
serendipitous. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just read these 2 paragraphs, and then there are a bunch of questions in these paragraphs. So if we have any musings or thoughts about the questions, let's just run with it after that. So, in other words, there is no single pattern. They're talking about the stages theory of human history. The only consistent phenomenon is the very fact of alteration and the consequent awareness of different social possibilities. What all this confirms is that searching for the origins of social inequality really is asking the wrong question. If human beings through most of our history have moved back and forth fluidly between different social arrangements, assembling and dismantling hierarchies on a regular basis, maybe the real question should be, how did we get stuck? How did we end up in one single mode? How did we lose that political self-consciousness once so typical of our species? How did we come to treat eminence and subservience not as temporary expedients or even the pomp and circumstance of some kind of grand seasonal theater, but as inescapable elements of the human condition? If we started out just playing games, at what point did we forget that we were playing?
It was the same one. I loved that. I thought that it was a really good, like, centralized talk about how we shifted between equal, unequal structures and how did we get stuck and why is it the case? And it probably really does tie into excess and, so, private property, which it gets into, I guess, in the next chapter.
Yeah. I think it's too like, and I'm sure others have mused on that too, but like does the size of the society play a role? Like it almost makes me think of our conversations around institutions and how they take on a life of their own. If you just apply that to whatever the state mantra is, I think a lot of people in the US today feel like they have very little control over anything that goes on in the United States, right? Like they don't have any way to influence it. And so why think about that? And that alone allows the state to get more power, right? Like if people aren't actively thinking about how do I influence this, or even just acknowledging what the institution is doing, unchecked institutions are going to naturally continue to accumulate wealth and power is kind of what I'm thinking. And maybe that's what we're seeing is, right, like once we got to surplus, then we got to certain population sizes where not everyone really knows what's going on in your tribe anymore, if you want to call it a tribe, right? If you don't feel like you are part of the political process, why are you going to exercise your political voice that I guess would have been much more common if it was like a group of 50 people? Like everyone's going to know what's going on, hopefully, right? Like you don't really have a choice in that scenario. It makes me think about growing up in a town of 500 people versus like then living in a city of, you always know kind of like what's happening in that town of 500 people if you're like talking to your neighbors and whatnot. But does that resonate? Like, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of one of these, a hypothetical scenario we can never really know about because a lot of this human history, the only evidence we have for it are whatever structures are still around or whatever artifacts, pots or tools or whatever. And so it really is this deep archaeological work is really hard to put a meaningful narrative together. You kind of have to appreciate the creative effort involved in just trying to put a meaningful story behind the evidence here. But I'm just trying to imagine one of these seasonal play kings, the season's almost over, my kingdom's about to get dismantled again, and we're going to have to go back to doing this boring thing for a while. Wonder how many people I can convince just to stay this year, not go back to the other way. Just stay and keep working for me until next year, and it'll work out. And so maybe that's like the first institution, And you can sort of imagine the snowball process from that point, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. Because I mean, I imagine the initial, I guess, stand up of those things would make these groups much more powerful than any of the surrounding. Like initially, like you've got that. Yeah, it's interesting to think about how that could have happened. I also, this not really, I don't know how helpful this is as far as the chapter goes, but something that kind of stuck out to me, he talks a lot about myth making and the stories that we kind of make up, right? And then tell them enough times, we kind of start believing the those stories, right? But there's the line in there, and I can't remember what page it's on, but it's talking about how early human society was like likely much more diverse, like from a physical attribute perspective, which just made me think about like the myths that we had of like um, hobbits and like different species and stuff like that. If that is that where that comes from, like a really, really ancient human history where we were all living together, like because they still have all of it talked about like the burials of these people that were either like prophets or people that today we might think of as like the person that's like the eccentric person, right? But in those times there was a reason for them, right?
Yeah. I actually highlighted it. It's on, well, part of it was on 103. They talk about the burials of these people, and they say it seems extremely unlikely that Paleological Europe produced a stratified elite that just happened to consist largely of hunchbacks, giants, and dwarfs, which probably
Right.
they should say people with dwarfism now. But it's like kind of like the same thing. Yeah, there's these myths of, I guess this point was like how maybe society valued different people, and it didn't just honor the elite. Where does this come from? This medieval, I don't know, these fantasies that we were given about giants and hunchbacks. I guess, yeah, grave doesn't mean like it's a fancy king, huh? It's just like people
Right.
can celebrate and honor other types of people.
It's just nice to hear that like eccentric people were sort of honored for their eccentricity, like, oh, it's not like, boo, you're a weirdo. It's like, oh, wow, you're weird. What do you know? What information
Yeah.
do you have? Are you our philosopher? Tell us
Yeah.
something. I don't know. I think that's beautiful. I don't know.
Yeah. And not a push to conform. It's not the Sparta that we've been told about, like throwing babies off cliffs and stuff like that. It's like everyone has something that they can contribute, and that's recognized by at least some of the tribes based off of some of the evidence.
But it's really interesting how they get like canonized, these different body types into our modern myths and fantasies of hobbits and yeah, all of it. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't remember where it was, but I liked refusal of the power structure. If you don't like it, you can just kind of like bug out and leave. And because there are other tribes, there are other groups out there, and power's not a permanent thing there. You can just walk away, and nobody's gonna try to stop you.
Yeah, I'm going to point out a moment in chapter 4 that I like a whole lot. I'm just going to call it the 3 freedoms that they illuminate, but one of them is the freedom to move, to be able to move when you want to move. And you can do that because there's this understanding between indigenous groups, even with different languages and different cultures, that, I don't know, it's almost like a compulsion to hospitality. Some human stranger comes walking in and you have a natural compulsion to invite them in and give them something if they need something. When we talked about the People's History of the United States and the Arawaks just sort of welcoming Columbus and his crew, like, oh, new people, yay. That's an example of that hospitality. Backfired for them, obviously, but... Okay, let me just read this last paragraph of chapter 3, and then I'll shut up, and then we can say whatever we want about chapter 3. Be this as it may, it's becoming increasingly clear that the earliest known evidence of human social life resembles a carnival parade of political forms far more than it does the drab abstraction of evolutionary theory. If there is a riddle here, it's this: why, after millennia of constructing and disassembling forms of hierarchy, did Homo sapiens, supposedly the wisest of apes, allow permanent and intractable systems of inequality to take root? Was this really a consequence of adopting agriculture, of settling down in permanent villages and later in towns? Should we be looking for a moment in time like the one Rousseau envisaged, when somebody first enclosed a tract of land declaring, "This is mine and always will be"? Or is that also another fool's errand?
You know what this reminds me of a little bit? Did you guys ever see, I think it was Gulliver's Travels? It was a TV series movie made for this, but there was a point where I think it was Gulliver Travels. Anyway, he goes to this land where there's unicorns that can talk to people, and then there's like early man, and early man like just goes after there's like diamonds all over the place. And so all early man or these early men care about are like these diamonds. They would just like try and gather these diamonds all the time, would be like super violent about it. And the unicorn after like the main character, like, oh my gosh, like diamonds, I can like take these back, because he's doing the same thing that early man is like with this. And then the unicorn people are like, you're one of them, get out of here. Like I can't talk to you anymore because you care more about these material possessions, right? Anyway, the reason that made me think was like, I don't know, is there some point where, and what he's talking about in this paragraph here, was there some point that why did we allow intractable systems of inequality to take root? I mean, it seems, I don't know, I'm not sure how to say this, but it seems to me like it's pretty clear that there is something inherently Homo sapien about greed or concern of lack of material resources that pushes us to try and make sure that we always have more. It might just be like genetic, right? Like we don't want to starve, right? That's clearly something. So there might be some sort of push for us to always need to see it like we have more resources, right? Like I don't know if that's part of it, if that's why, but it seems like looking at today, why do we have these immovable systems that are inequality? Well, it's because there's people that are benefiting and want to keep it that way. Is that just part of human nature to have that be part of, or some part of our population? Does that make sense of what I'm saying? Like that's just a part of us to want more or to fear not having what we need.
Yeah, it's hard to know. It's like, philosophically, is it like a genetic chemical in the brain, or is it like a societal value system that's pressed upon us,
Right.
Which I think they
Yeah.
do, they are like analyzing that. But definitely, I think like what I thought about when you were saying that is how anecdotally, when I've seen people who have a lot of money in life or excess or wealth, like actual wealth, they have the exact same mentality as the people that I know that have the absence of all of that. They both think that they are resource poor,
Yeah.
and they both justify, whatever their life is, saying like, oh, I have nothing, I have nothing, I don't have enough. And it just creates even more, excess. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's weird how paranoia is sort of tied up in it. Like there's this, I don't know, there's just some fear that it's all going to go away, or that if I don't keep accumulating, I won't have enough. I don't. It's a lot of this for us in the modern world. I'm wondering how much of it is conditioned on this. You know, what is a career? Like as a concept, what is a career in relationship to a retirement? And is this an actual natural human thing that we're doing, or is this some weird way that our paranoia has allowed us to morph our culture into belief that we have to have a career, and then we do all we can for this career, and then we get to retire, and then it's like that's such a weird way to live. But I think it's like deeply interwoven with paranoia about
Mm.
resources.
Yeah. Yeah. Paranoia about like, oh, I don't want to be 67 years old and have no one to take care of me and just be like destitute and not be able to work because I can't physically do it. That's definitely a fear that's instilled from a very early age, like at least in modern times, you know?
Is it connected to isolation? Is it connected to this belief that no one else is going to look out for us if we don't do this? That we
Yeah.
don't have a community to lean on when we need it?
I feel like it has to be because like if imagine if I've been thinking about this a lot more recently, but like Great Depression, families collapsing to like one home, and like like that kind of reaction to like hardship where people tend to come together and support each other, and I think that individualism that we have in the United States, it's like, oh, you go and you get your bag, right? Like go take care of yourself, right? That pushes people out and makes them think that way and makes them feel like they can only depend on themselves, right? Like that's the only person. But if we lived in kind of like a different sort of society where maybe family homes were more common, like where people all lived together for generations or something like that, maybe that feeling wouldn't be there. I don't know, right? I'm just like speculating now, but like if you feel like you have a safety net, where it doesn't require you to toil every single day, then yeah, I'd feel more comfortable. So I gotta find like a whole family to move into my house with me so that I feel more comfortable.
I mean, how many people our age are brainstorming and fantasizing and planning and actually doing communes together at this point? Like we're all having a similar kind of reaction. Like, this isn't working. This isn't sustainable. We got to figure something else out. We're doing the thing that humans have always done. It's just hard to do it when we have such a rigid infrastructural system set up. But you can see people working that out. Yeah.
That's just a plug for the Propaganda Loves You commune. We'll have that stood up here in, I don't know, a couple years maybe. Who knows?
Anything? I guess we're done with chapter 3, unless you guys have other things that you want to bring up.
I liked, I liked the like anarchist project they got in the end, where they mention this, Nietzschean beyond good and evil stuff. Because I think, I was like just serendipitously, right now in my book pile reading list, I got my Nietzsche stuff. And he has like a similar project where like, he traces a genealogical perspective, and it's like, I think his is more about there's no single origin of morality. It's messy. And so it's kind of the same thing with history and prehistory. And it was just really interesting to learn about the term prehistory in these Brixham caves in the 1800s, where they found these tools. And it was just a really interesting perspective. So anything that makes something really neat, that's perceived really neat, and makes it a little messy, and like that's like the project to undergo here, I love it. So it was a really insightful chapter.
I think if I had to close out this chapter on anything, it's just basically one sentence that's really near the end. It's like the 117. And this was, I think, Joe, this sentence leads into the paragraph talking about how kings were fake and everything, like at the time, and now we have play kings again. But the line is, medieval peasants often found it much easier than medieval intellectuals to imagine a society of equals. And I just thought that was really funny. Like, it's like the people that like are treated the worst are like, oh, I could totally imagine a society where we're all like the same. And it's the people that are like, benefiting from the surplus, right? That are like, well, we could never, like, I don't understand how that would work. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. So I thought that was a good way to end that.
Yeah, I agree. That's a great line.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow, and the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.